one of our present here, I, Vaishnavi Singh, takes an opportunity to extend a very warm welcome on behalf of Global of Foreign Studies, New Delhi. Now, I request Mr. M.K. Singh, sir, Honorary Director of Research at FGS, to please take forward.
Hello and welcome to Forum for Global Studies, latest podcast. Here we invite prominent change makers and academic eminence from the world over to share their insights on the burning topics of relevance in the present times. I am Colonel Manoj Kumar Singh, Director of Research at Forum for Global Studies, who would be your moderator for this afternoon's podcast. Before joining the FGS, I superannuated from the Indian Army after rendering 33 years of service. I had the privilege to command my regiment, that is 10 Bihar Regiment, in the Kashmir Valley. I also had the privilege to train with the US Army in 97 in psychological warfare. Forum for Global Studies is an independent, progressive, non-profit, non-partisan think tank based out of New Delhi. It is dedicated to promoting quality research and de novo discourses on public policy, geopolitics, diplomacy, and international relations. At the very outset, I extend a very warm welcome to our guest speaker, Dr. Vasily Kashin. And this afternoon, we are delighted to have with us Dr. and Professor Vasily Kashin, Director at Center for Comprehensive European and National Studies at the National Research University, Higher School of Economics in Moscow. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for inviting me.
My internet is unstable, so I'll switch off my video. Please don't mind that. Okay, continuing, Dr. Kashin published a number of monographic researches and analytical reports and essays in Russia, USA, Singapore, Sweden, and Philippines. Now coming to the topic of the day for the podcast. Our topic is Beijing-Moscow's No Limits Partnership, and does it signal a new world order? Okay, as the Chinese President Xi Jinping left a state reception at Kremlin on 21st March 23, he turned to his Russian counterpart, Mr. Putin, and said the world was undergoing changes, the likes of which we haven't seen for 100 years, and we are the ones driving these changes together. To this, Putin said, I agree, shaking hands with the Chinese leader in an exchange that was captured on camera. Xi's 3-day visit was his first since Russia launched special operations against Ukraine last year. It was the latest step in Beijing's bid to promote an alternative international order that is less dominated by the United States and the West. But many experts also feel that the situation highlights the extent to which Moscow, which is somewhat weakened by the long-drawn war, may have to settle for playing his second fiddle. Now, these meetings between Xi and Putin held in Kremlin for 3 days till 21st March 23, with each referring to the other side as the old friend. It further cemented ties between Beijing and Moscow. Both the countries are already united by their anti-West hostility and bound by the no limits friendship declared when the Putin visited Beijing days before launching special operations on Ukraine in February 22. On display during the state visit was its personal rapport between Xi and Putin, who have met each other 40 times in the past 10 years. That's quite substantial, 40 times in the last 10 years. There was no statement from Xi talking about Beijing's direct support for Moscow on the Russia's ongoing special operations. But there was little doubt, however, which side Beijing was standing on. For Putin, Xi's visit was a shot in the arm as the country was constantly shunned by the West. It helped even more since Xi also referred to Putin's strong leadership. The leaders issued 2 joint statements, one focusing on economic cooperation and the other on the strengthening of their strategic partnership. Chinese official media said Xi and Putin agreed to strengthen bilateral ties based on principles of good neighborhood, friendship, and win-win cooperation, as well as to deepen the China-Russia comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination for a new era. So coming to the topic per se and coming to our guest speaker, Dr. Vasily Kashin, I'm coming to the questions now. Our first question is, how do you see this journey of Sino-Russian no limits partnership this far? What is there for each of these countries in this partnership? Please elaborate.
Thank you very much. I believe that the basis for the Russian-Chinese partnership at this moment is the common position towards the US-dominated global order and to the US attempts to maintain its hegemony. So basically, since the United States has adopted a more assertive and offensive position towards both China and Russia, it could be expected that Russia and China would boost their cooperation in opposing the United States. And I can tell you that during Trump administration, United States started to openly characterize the Chinese ruling regime as hostile communist regime, which was problematic not because of any specific actions which it was undertaken, but simply because it was led by the Communist Party of China. After Biden administration came to power, one of the first thing Biden administration tried to do against the Chinese in 2021 was an attempt to push the accusations of genocide policies in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Basically, what Biden administration tried to do, they tried to create a legal base for suing China for genocide. And basically, when one government accuses another government of genocide, there's no doubt about the nature of the relationship. It's a very hostile relationship, and it started during Trump administration, but that hostile course was fully continued by the Biden administration. The position of the United States towards Russia has been clear since at least 2012, and the United States have almost openly pursued policy of regime change towards Russia, basically with U.S. strategic goal being splitting Russia or at least weakening to such an extent that it wouldn't be able to conduct any independent or active foreign policy. So we have a common goal in opposing the United States. Russia is currently taking most of the American pressure, but the Chinese are absolutely interested in Russia to succeed, and they are providing substantial economic support. That support is coming in two major ways. First, it's China boosting bilateral trade and investment with Russia, and Russia managed to expand its exports to China last year by more than 40%, and the trade volume between the two countries grew by 1/3. Second is providing substantial industrial cooperation. And what Russia is currently doing, since Ukrainian war has shown that industrial capacities of both Russia and NATO were not sufficient for this kind of war, Russia is conducting defense industrial buildup, boosting defense production. And China is a significant partner, significant source of imports of advanced machine tools, components, and other industrial goods. And that is something which is allowing Russia to both maintain economic stability and fight the war with relatively modest costs and losses.
Dr. Kashin, very well said. What you have elaborated is absolutely correct. But as you mentioned that trade between China and Russia has grown many folds, and so has the trade grown with India as well, and many other countries. Russia has forged new frontiers in trade. But on the other hand, there is a question that maximum exports and trade between the Chinese companies have with the West and US. How do you see that it will not endanger, like siding with Russia will not endanger the trade of Chinese trade with the West, their interest in trade that they have in the West?
Well, if we look at the history, we can see that actually trade volume has always been a very poor stabilizer for bilateral relations. Both world wars were basically fought between the countries which were the main economic partners to each other. If we take World War I, German and British Empire had huge trade, and Russia had very significant trade with Germany. And if we take Asia before World War II, the Japanese Empire had most of its trade with United States, and then came India, which was at that time controlled by the British. Then came China, and then came Dutch colonies in Indonesia. So these were the very country which Imperial Japan has attacked, 37 and 41. And like if we try to apply this kind of logic, which is sometimes applied to China policies now to Imperial Japan, we had to expect that Japan would either stay passive or attack the Soviet Union, with which Japan never had any significant trade. Instead of that, Japan attacked the very countries which were its main trade partners. Here is basically the same situation. Yes, they do have huge trade, but they also have huge political differences. Besides, the model of this trade is changing. The structural cause for Sino-US hostility is not that Chinese government is communist or they don't have democracy or something like that. That's the economic model of China's development, which is well represented by their Made in China 2025 national strategy. And basically, several years ago, US President Donald Trump called Made in China 2025 a real trigger for starting trade war with China. Why was that? Because what China is trying to do now, when they reached the level of mid-income country, their mid-income economy, they have an aging population. They have a growing deficit of workforce. And what they are trying to do, they are boosting huge amount of government money into research and innovation. And they invest huge amount of money into industrial policies. And they try to boost a number of big Chinese high-tech companies, which would be able to first take control over the China's market and then expand internationally. And we have already a number of success stories, or at least it used to be success stories before US started to impose sanctions, and that included Huawei, Lenovo, ZTE, and others. And if China wants to achieve its goal, if China achieves these goals, that means that it has to displace the United States and the leading US companies and the leading European companies as well from their positions in the world, from their position on the world market. So if China wants to continue development, and if China really wants to reach the level of a developed country, be comparable with Western Europe in per capita terms, that means that there will be huge redistribution of power and wealth in the world. And this is something what the United States are trying to stop, and trying to do that by isolating China, weakening China economically, creating powerful military deterrent, and forcing China to and trying basically to cause an economic downturn in China. And China is resisting that. That's the reason. And both sides are currently seeing this huge trade volume which exists between United States and China as a vulnerability. What China is trying to do, what is the focus of Chinese economic policies, that's diversification of external trade and an attempt to reduce reliance of the economy on exports in general. And what is US trying to do? They're trying to force their businesses to relocate, to conduct reshoring or friendshoring, return the production facilities to the United States or move them to other countries which are supposed to be friendlier to the United States. And India will likely be one of main beneficiaries of these U.S. and of these U.S. policies, together with such countries as Mexico, Vietnam, probably Brazil, and others.
Okay, so there was Finland joining NATO recently. Hasn't the West scored a big strategic victory over Russia? Sweden and some other nations are also equally to join NATO. NATO sitting at Russian borders was perhaps totally unacceptable to Putin. What do you say on this, sir?
Well, if we talk about Sweden and Finland joining NATO, that hardly represents any change in Russia's strategic situation. Basically, if we talk about Sweden, while being a neutral country on paper, had maintained extremely close relations with NATO since 1950s, participated in joint exercises and joint military planning with NATO, and even had some small clashes with Soviet Union on Baltic Sea. They have always been considered by the Soviet and Russian leadership as basically an extension of NATO. Now that's being formalized, but strategic calculus always included Swedish forces as part of the opposing force. The situation with Finland used to be different during the Cold War, because during the Cold War, Finland was subject to a policy which was basically named after its Finlandization. It maintained its own internal politics, but aligned with Soviet Union on the international arena. But that all was gone since early 90s. Since 1990s, Finland started to engage with NATO. They had constant joint training, alignment of defense procurement policies, deep exchange of intelligence information, and basically that used to be a growing pattern, and we started to look at them as on another informal extension of NATO years ago. So basically that only what happens now with Finland is only formalizes something which happened many years ago. We had to take into account that Finland was a potential enemy in case of war even many years ago. It's not a major problem. So yes, they used this situation to speed things up. It would happen anyway, sooner or later. It doesn't affect our general strategic goals in Ukraine, which will be achieved sooner or later. And of course, that will have certain global consequences for the US position in the world as well.
Correct, sir. But the issue was that NATO expansion to the, borders of Russia was always a pain point for Russia. That's what the world always about. Anyway, sir, coming to the next question. Recently, some reports appeared wherein China unilaterally gave Chinese names to nations and places along large borders with many countries, including some of them belonging to India and Russia. Chinese claimed these territories as their own.
I understand the general question. Maybe I might start answering it.
Yes, you can.
Okay, thank you very much. So it refers to the reports about the Chinese naming some some towns and geographical locations in the border areas of the adjacent countries. So I read the original Chinese document, and I just know what's said there exactly, and I know the Chinese practices. I believe these reports to be an intentional exaggeration and probably some kind of Western information operation, because what happened really? The Chinese have a very old practice that certain geographical locations like cities, they're named after their official names, which are given them by respective governments. But since these names are very long and cannot be well transcribed by the Chinese, it's simply extremely difficult for the Chinese to pronounce them. They simultaneously use the old Chinese historical names, which are sometimes centuries long and which are short. They can be well pronounced by the Chinese. And these Chinese names actually used only for reference and with special sign that it's for reference, and it's named in the official Chinese document that it's for reference for the Chinese public to better understand. And that has been the practice since times immemorial. Basically, they always operated like that for their own convenience. And I should say that, for example, we are not that much different for the Chinese, because in Russia we are in fact not using Chinese names for certain Chinese cities such as Beijing, and we are using the names which became a kind of historically accepted in Russia. So we call Beijing Peking, and in Chinese it sounds Beijing. And the Chinese have spent some time trying to convince us to pronounce this name according to their rules. They didn't work, so they abandoned it. So I believe the issue of naming was intentionally blown up by someone. In the original Chinese document, it said that these additional historical Chinese names are given just for reference, and I don't see a problem here.
Right, sir. But interestingly, China has border issues and disputes with almost all the countries in its neighborhood, including some of the countries which are far off, like Indonesia. They don't share the tree even, but they still have disputes. That said, sir, we'll move on to the next question. What, in your view, are the challenges to the new multipolar world order, and suggest ideas as to how these could be overcome if there are any challenges? How do you visualize the panning out of the world order in the coming 1 or 2 years?
Well, I believe the greatest challenge could be further destabilization and split of the global economy into several economic blocks. So we all are benefiting quite a lot from globalization, but what can happen? The United States has already succeeded in cutting the Russian economy from the Western economy. They failed to isolate Russia, thanks to our friends in India, in Arab countries, in China, and all around the world. But Russia is already cut from the Western economy. If there is a new wave of escalation, for example, in Asia, for example, conflict around Taiwan, then there will be an attempt to impose similar amount of sanctions on China, and that would be a complete disaster for the global economy, taking into account the fact that Chinese economy is 10 times bigger than the Russian economy, and China is present in almost every production chain in the world. So this could lead to real fragmentation of the global economy. So our main threat is our constant US attempts to first weaponize the role of global financial center, and second, we might suffer from their abuse of their role of the global financial center. That what I mean by abuse is constant and uncontrollable growth of the United States public debt, which is absolutely huge, which is bigger than it used to be during World War II, and the growth of US total debt, which is also huge. And total debt is very big in China as well, but that's internal. It's not affecting the outside world to the same degree. But when the Americans are conducting something like quantitative easing, or when they are boosting their expenditure, what they're doing when they're printing money, basically when Federal Reserves buys treasuries, they are exporting their inflation to the outside world. Everyone is suffering from that. Everyone has to take this burden, no matter where they live. Where they live, and sooner or later, that will bring the whole global economy to imbalance, and will undermine globalization. So we have a set of very irresponsible policies by the United States, which might disrupt the whole global economy, and basically everyone should be prepared for that.
My last question here, sir. Recently, Chinese have succeeded in bringing together countries, Saudi Arabia and Iran, and then they have also been give a 12-point proposal to bring peace between Russia and Ukraine, which was hailed by Putin. However, the same was rejected by the West because it seemed towards Russian side. Have these few successes encouraged China in playing bigger role in breaking multipolarity to the world order, and how far can they become successful?
Well, thank you very much for this question. What we see a transformation of the Chinese foreign policy, and the process of China taking a more active role in global governance. China has came up with a number of global initiatives, which include Global Security Initiative, Global Development Initiative, and Global Civilization Initiative. These initiatives, they describe how China sees the development of the world, and what China is doing, it's gradually gathering support behind these initiatives. I believe each of these initiatives have close to 100 countries subscribed under them. And of course, normalization of ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia, it was a maximum triumph for the Chinese diplomacy for decades. This is the first time such a major diplomatic deal was signed in the Middle East without any US participation. But that was possible only because both Saudi Arabia and Iran were independent players genuinely interested in restoring their relationship. At the same time, it was possible because China was not taking any part of in their previous conflicts and maintaining very robust economic relations with both of them. It will be much harder to play the same role in Russia-Ukraine conflict because basically the West already is considering China to be the enemy, almost as acute as Russia. But China will try, so the Chinese position is not really a peace plan. Its position, which China wants to secure support for this position from maximum number of countries all around the world. But China will probably try to play a similar mediatory role in other conflicts. I would expect something like that happen, for example, somewhere in Africa, and that would help boosting Chinese influence, because the Chinese they are already having huge economic leverage, and they don't have that kind of bad historical heritage which the Americans and Europeans have. They can be trusted by all sides in many parts of the world. So yes, they will explore that, and they will probably be relatively successful.
Sir, I feel that it is not just the Chinese assertiveness, it's also the willingness of these countries, some of these Middle Eastern countries, because they also wanted to reset their relations with West, and they have suffered the hegemony of USA for a long time. And they themselves, like UAE, Saudi Arabia, they've all tried to reset their relationship with Asian countries, like with India itself. The relations with India and UAE, the way they are, they have never been before historically. And similarly, India is very close to Saudi Arabia now. So it has, given a fertile ground for Chinese to, execute this kind of deal that they have done, and which is good for the Middle East as well.
Yeah, correct.
One more question, sir. Here I want to ask you, as to India has always been a very reliable friend of Russia throughout the history. What role do you visualize for India? Because India also has a lot of assertiveness now. You have seen that in G20 declaration in Indonesia, which was brought about by India's interference, not interference, India's participation there. What do you see? How do you see Indian role, and especially in relation to Russia?
Basically, our goal is to have India as our major economic and political partner in Asia and in global politics in general. Because what Russia wants to engage with Asia, not just with China. Chinese are good friends, but you should never actually be concentrated on one market. You shouldn't be over dependent on one partner. So Russia is genuinely interested in India becoming another major global superpower, comparable to China in its role, in India growing as Russian economic partner, becoming another market for Russian exports, becoming Russian industrial partner. And basically the current situation brings us new opportunities. We see a very significant growth in our trade volume, but also there are many opportunities for Indian industries like electronics industry, information technology industry, drug and pharmaceutical industry to engage with Russia and to get better access to the Russian market. And as I understand, some work is already being done on that.
Wonderful, sir. It was really insightful interacting with you, and we look forward to many more sessions with you, sir. And
Yes, sir.
we have Professor Kashin from Brazil, and if he may have any questions to ask, please.
Just like to say thank you very much for Professor Kashin. It was a very distinguished point that the professor made. I think that one point the professor pointed out, and which I believe it's part of the general issues at hand, is the approach between countries such as India with Russia, China and Russia, and I would say also that Brazil is together with Russia in many key points. From our perspective, our shadow foreign secretary has last week been in Moscow, spoke with Russian President Vladimir Putin, and next week probably Sergei Lavrov will come to Brazil and speak with our president. So there may be let's say, the two countries are coming together in many different points, while Brazil can at the same time maintain itself relatively close to the West. We are globally at the West, but at the same time together with Russia, China and India, we have a very strong BRICS friendship. I would like to see Professor Kashin's inputs on Brazil-Russia relation. What does Russia expect from Brazil?
Yes, thank you very much for this question, Professor Zan. Yes, we very highly value a Brazilian position. Brazil has not supported any anti-Russian sanctions or any anti-Russian moves. We fully understand that Brazil has very close economic interdependency with the United States and European Union, still we see that there are opportunities to development of our economic relations with Brazil, especially now, and we would be interested in especially boosting cooperation in industry. And there are, of course, opportunities for Brazilian exporters of equipment, machine tools, chemicals, etc. We have potential in agricultural business, and maybe we can in future have greater cooperation in space and nuclear technology. Brazil is also becoming one of priorities for our foreign policy work. But of course, our relations with China and India are historically more developed. Sometimes we don't have enough experience in operating in Latin America in general. We do have some good experts on Latin America, but just not enough of them. There is not this kind of huge ecosystem. So we are exploring these new capabilities, and this is another growing dimension of our foreign policy.
Thank you very much for the questions, for the answer, Professor.
Thank you, Kashin sir. And now I invite Nandini Ghosh to give a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Colonel sir. And today, on behalf of Forum for Global Studies, I offer the vote of thanks to all the panelists present here, and especially to the speaker, Dr. Kashin, for his elaborate explanation of the newly changing realities on the global strategic milieu and also the security situation there, and which is developing in the world, and how its ramifications going to be on number of issues and the bilateral relations and on Asia. And I thank you, Dr. Kashin, again for your very beautiful explanation of the situations from the perspective of Russia and from the perspective of a researcher. And I thank the Forum for Global Studies for organizing such a nice event to understand the global security milieu and the economic situation spanning out very fast. And what was distinct possibility in a few years ago is now going as a fast changing reality. So it's been a nice experience for me too, and thank the Honorable President of FGS, Dr. Tripathi sir. And I also thank you, the colleague of ours, Professor Jain, for his very nice intervention in this discussion. And I thank my fellow mate Vaishnavi for part in this discussion. I thank everyone for this nice discussion. Thank you. Over to you, Colonel.
Thank you, Nandini. And Vasily sir, we look forward to having more interactions with you on topics. Your expertise in China, India, Russia, and all these relationships are unique, and you can provide kind of insights that you have provided are actually very, very fruitful. And we look forward to more interactions with you. And do ask us to join you in case of Forum for Global Studies can participate anywhere in your discussions in Russia. And
Very much, sir.
Dr. Tripathi, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you so much, Professor Kashin, for joining us, for accepting our invitation. And thank you so much, Colonel and Kashin, for this very insightful moderation of this session. And my dear friend, Professor Kashin from Brazil, thank you so much for joining and for your kind intervention on this session. Thank you, Nandini, for your vote of thanks. Thanks all. And I do hope that in future we will organize this kind of debate and discussion. Thank you so much.